Hello, everyone who's filing in. I think we're just going to wait for everyone to get here, start about the actual starting time. Some people will be on YouTube, some people will be in the meeting itself. Hello, Rob. How you doing?
Hello.
Hello, hello. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Doing pretty well this morning. Can't lie. I'm pretty excited. I think we have a really good panel here.
Yeah, it'll be nice.
Yeah, so just wait until start time. Everybody's piling in. I think we have some watching on YouTube, some who are here in the meeting itself.
Good.
Yeah.
I'll just get my notebook out because I know I go third, so I want to learn what the others say.
Oh, yeah. I've got mine as well. Don't worry.
Yeah. Let me change up my background a little bit. Let's see.
I do like that one, though.
Yeah, that's my daughter's at the beach.
Oh, it's really sweet.
In Stinson Beach off near San Francisco.
That's really, really nice. I've never been out there, but it looks really beautiful. Hey, Jay.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Rob. You're here too. Donna, Pia,
Hey.
you're all here. Great.
Let's see.
Well, Chris, we have some long bios in front of us, so maybe we should make sure we don't go into.
We do. Yes.
Detail.
I actually wrote that in. I was like, the people we have are just so qualified. If I actually talked about them, I could do it for an hour and 15 minutes. Like, take all our time.
Yeah. Even though we have such a high power panel, I think we can keep this as casual as we like. We're the ones who
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's great that we can also tie in our audience this way.
It's nice. And I'm pretty excited. I like we've only done a few online webinars, just given, the whole COVID situation making it sort of a necessity. But it's been really interesting the way that they've sort of developed and how it's sort of, in my view, actually sort of increased engagement in a lot of ways. It's been pretty awesome.
It's always been a necessity in YSI. It's more like a stopgap between the meetings we have in person, sort of just keep the community together. And it's been a very effective tool. But now, of course, we're shifting into a primary mode of engagement this way.
Yeah, must be nice. Hi, Robert. Good to see you.
Hey, good morning.
Morning, morning. Yeah, I think I've mentioned this since everybody's been hopping in, but I'm just going to wait until everybody's here. Give it a few minutes for everyone watching to queue up as well, and then get started with introductions, and then I think we'll just be off.
Sounds good.
Yeah, as you were saying, Jay, I mean, it's nice that the YSI kind of had it set up prior to. They had the infrastructure for it. I'm sure that made the transition a lot easier.
It's an uneasy situation regardless, even if you're somewhat prepared for it.
Yeah.
And therefore, please excuse me, I'm in my kitchen, so in case
Got no problem.
noise.
Yeah, we are all going through the natural acclimation to online environments, even still.
Robert, I'm going to just call you Robert and Rob Johnson Rob, so we can establish that. So there's two Roberts. Robert, where are you based right now? Are you in DC at the moment?
I'm in Ellicott City, Maryland, just west of Baltimore.
Oh, nice. Are y'all getting any of the hurricane that's coming up along the coast? I don't know.
It's been on for a few. It's supposed to keep going for a few hours, but it's not. Heavy winds haven't hit. It's just a really good, steady, soaking rain. So we have a stream out back that I'm watching as I speak to you that's prone to flash flooding. So if you see me looking off to the right, that's what I'm watching for. But I don't think it will. I think I don't think it's quite that heavy.
That's pretty nice. Yeah, well, I'm down here in Florida. We were real worried about it for a few minutes, but it seems like it's just going to go all the way up the East Coast, which is nice in some ways. Feel pretty bad for the Northerners, but what can you do?
A lot of us need it.
Has it really been that dry up there?
It's been pretty dry, and it gets overblown. It seems to me that for the past 10 years, really sort of since the financial crisis, there's only been one weather forecast, which is apocalypse.
Just about. It does
every
feel like
snowstorm is a polar vortex. Every time it rains, it's a hurricane. It's just weather.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel that. As someone whose family falls victim to that very easily, and so we're kind of doomsday preppers. Hi, Andrew. Good to have you in here. Oh, did he hop out? Oh no, he's still here. Hi, Andrew.
Hi. Good evening, Andrew. It's good to see
Hear
you
me?
too.
Hi,
Yes,
hi, Jay. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yep, sounding good.
Good. I look a little bit pale. I don't know why, but
There you go.
I like the background though. Seems like you've been doing a little
that's
light reading.
That's my library. Okay.
Wow. Nice.
Hey, Rob, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good.
I enjoyed your Buckminster Fuller article. I thought that was great.
No. We are literally, his trajectory, his spaceship, Earth, is a great metaphor. Okay. We're on the spaceship Earth, and on the one hand, we either go for mutually assured destruction, nuclear war. On the left, we're in a burning planet.
Does feel like that sometimes.
Yeah, we're literally there. It's a terrible situation.
Tough. Well, glad we're gonna get to break down some of it today.
You look fantastic with this planet, rising sun, behind. I haven't had a chance to put my screen back there.
Yeah, it's nice. Pretty fancy.
Okay, let me get my notes together. We still have some time, right? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone's doing the same thing. I know when Rob joined, he pulled out his notebook, getting ready.
Yeah, and we're going to say this in a moment anyway. Anybody that's on the call should feel as part of the conversations. Obviously, Chris and I will be starting us off with questions and introducing speakers, and that's a conversation that we're beginning with them as the first ones giving the input. But obviously, we're going to welcome all of you to contribute and ask your questions, and that's really the nature of this conversation, to not be shy behind our screens, but to really engage with these challenging questions that will be raised today. And I think we want to continue that conversation, not just in this webinar, but maybe in future webinars and future cooperations. Obviously, OWP and YSI are set up to, make sure that we capture some of the energy of today's conversation. So if you have some questions already on your mind, note them down and be ready to bring them into the conversation later.
Yeah, absolutely. I know on our end, we have crowdsourced a few questions in advance. And then also, if you're from the OWP and watching from the YouTube live stream, the chat's always there. You can plug them in. I'll be checking in on that, see if anyone has any questions as we go along. For those who are sort of not familiar with the format, we're going to do 20 minutes of speaking from Andrew, 20 minutes of speaking from Robert Daly. For those who are just joining us recently, Robert Daly will be Robert for the purposes of this meeting. Rob Johnson will be Rob. Rob will then speak for 10 minutes, and then we are going to go into a more sort of free-form discussion question period where, as Jay mentioned, everyone should feel free to kind of try and get involved. If you have a question that you feel super pertinent, absolutely speak up and try and get that in there. And looks like we're coming up close, just a few more minutes, and then we can get things sort of officially kicked off.
Okay, better tell my wife not to come into the room.
Absolutely, yeah. Everybody, make sure we're ready. Sediment.
Well, Andrew, you can just invite your wife to join the conversation. I'm actually quite interested about her opinion too. I'm glad you didn't hear that, but it's all over YouTube, so we should cut that out later.
Yeah, we'll go back and edit it out for sure.
No, this is bright, but it's a bit too bright, I think. Is that better?
Looking good.
Yeah, that's fine.
So Francis, the idea is that you can use video, supposedly, I mean, however you want, right? If you want to have your video on, go for it. The chat itself, I think, is primarily where you can submit questions, but if there is like a lull or some downtime in speaking, feel free to, actually speak up and say something. Or if we are just like, open room for questions and you feel that it would be easier for you to convey it just saying it rather than writing it, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. All right, yeah, I think we're about a minute out. So Jay, whenever you want to get us started, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm expecting people to dial in during the first couple minutes as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
I will simply begin anyway. Maybe with a backstory about how the series came about. Obviously, you caught the name, Geopolitics and Economics, and today's discussion is on the rise of China. If we look at it, obviously, it's kind of maybe coincidence or not, but it's very timely. If you look in the news today, you can see the discussion around TikTok and it having to be sold potentially to a U.S. firm. Microsoft is in the conversation, but obviously there is much more simmering under the surface, and I think we want to really get into some of the deep conversations that imply really a cross-section between geopolitical issues and economic issues. As we said in the description, we believe that, as we will discuss today, a lot of these conversations are inherently intertwined, and that's also really the reason that Chris and I started this conversation, to bring these two communities together. And the communities are, of course, OWP, which is the Organization for World Peace. So if you're joining from the OWP network, welcome to all of you. OWP is the Organization for World Peace. It's a nonprofit aimed at cultivating peace and justice globally through education, advocacy, and encouraging individuals to think critically about solutions to the most challenging issues facing the world today. And then the other organizing organization is INET's Young Scholars Initiative, and that is the Young Scholars Initiative is an initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. You see that INET's president, of course, is the discussant today, Rob Johnson. YSI is a global community of more than 13,000 students, young professionals, and researchers across the globe who are pursuing new and critical ways of thinking about the economy. And obviously, we're both two communities of young critical thinkers in slightly different spheres, and this is a starting point for us to have an ongoing conversation between geopolitics and economics. And I think the issue, especially that we're raising today with the rise of China, if we want to introduce the topic a little bit, I will not go into any detail, but I think it's the writing is on the wall. We can see that the rise of China, which in terms of economic rise, coincides with the era of globalization. Basically, we can pinpoint it to around 1990, and that's the same time when we defined the second era of globalization to begin. And simply put, globalization means a increased integration of trade and finance across national boundaries. And China in this process has, of course, lifted about 1 billion people, many people out of poverty, but while at the same time putting itself at the center of our current economic order. And at the same time, we see that with this economic power comes now a more assertive Chinese geopolitical role. And these two roles are now being put into practice. And what I would like to focus on today is simply the fact, if we just go through a lot of the issues today, and that's, if you're talking about global order, we also see the role of the United States being challenged and redefined, and how the US reacts to this rise of China as one challenge to the economic order, but also to its geopolitical order at the same time. And so we can see from many different angles that these issues cannot be separated very clearly. And I can just raise, a number of issues that we'll be for sure speaking about today. And that is the issue of intellectual property rights. That's been an issue that Trump has raised as an issue he would like to bring up. We've seen the geopolitical conversation around Huawei and the 5G networks. We've now seen in the news today, TikTok. And then of course, we also see the meeting and already the tensions that have come with China and Taiwan. That's been longstanding, but China's more assertiveness in the South China Sea, China getting more involved economically in Africa. I think there are many different dimensions to this conversation that we could bring into this conversation today. And that sort of assumes, maybe a provocation at the beginning that has been raised in many different outlets to say, is there something like a new Cold War brewing? And I would maybe say the analogy might not be very nice, but very good. It's very different at the outset, but there is something about a reordering of the order that we have to account for. And I think that's what the nature of today's conversation is all about. And now I'll hand it over to Chris to also welcome you to this conversation and introduce our speakers.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay. As Jay mentioned, China's kind of rising influence in a myriad of both regions and issues has sparked huge debates across a range of disciplines. And two of those disciplines who have been sort of prime in that discussion are economics and geopolitics. This webinar attempts a sort of meeting of the minds of a sort from these two disciplines who have had quite a bit of say on the rise of China. Our first speaker, and I'll try and keep all of these brief, boasts a long and storied history in both academic and governmental work. Andrew Sheng is currently a distinguished fellow at the Asia Global Institute and previously has served as the chairman of the Securities and Future Commissions of Hong Kong and as a central banker at the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. So suffice to say, Andrew has a long history of working in these sort of issues, both from the perspective of someone who has lived and worked in China and someone from the perspective who has worked in a more international arena. Our second speaker, Robert Daly, also has that experience. Robert directs the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center. Prior to that, he served in the U.S. Foreign Service at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And our third and final speaker, Rob Johnson, serves currently as the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and has previously served as the managing director of the Soros Fund Management. So we have a very good mix, I'd say, of the geopolitical aspects and the economic perspective. I'm excited to jump into it. So with introductions out of the way, we can get to our first speaker. Andrew, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Jay and Chris. Glad to be here. Talking about China in 20 minutes is mission impossible. This is a humongous one thing. Basically, eliminated roughly 800 million, taken 800 million, and rose from a very poor country, even behind India 40 years ago, to become the second largest economy in the world, the largest trading partner in the world, major manufacturing power in the world, basically manufactures all 635 categories of manufactured products that are also traded. So China, the right word for it is probably a behemoth, a huge economy that is now the concern of everybody, including the Chinese. I think the question is, what is the role of China with the rest of the world? And what I want to do in the next 10, 15 minutes is really to give you a, probably maybe biased, but what I really want to show is how the Chinese see their historical revival. The Chinese, if you really look at Chinese history, you must remember, and I think, a lot of the today's press talk about China as if Chinese history started in 1978 when China went on the reform path. But actually, when you're dealing with the Chinese bureaucracy, it is the longest surviving bureaucracy in the world, the oldest and the largest. The second largest is actually the Catholic Church. But the Chinese entity has been in its existence since the unification of China in 221 BC. And the basic structure of 36 provinces and center, province, now you add provincial grade cities, and then the towns and counties, and then the rural areas, has been in that position since 2021 BC. And the bureaucracy basically was formed, centralized bureaucracy was formed around then, and eventually became a meritocratic bureaucracy called mandarins, who came by exams in 600 AD, okay? And that's when the Catholic Church was established. And that bureaucracy has existed through the decay of the empire, the rise of the empire, invasion by foreigners, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're talking about China, you're really dealing with a very old bureaucracy. But you say, well, what about the Communist Party of China? Well, up until 1911, when the monarchic and dynastic system collapsed, essentially, it was very difficult to do succession. And it was succeeded by a nationalist warlord type system, which was fundamentally capitalist. And then they had the civil war between the communists and the nationalist government. And the Communist Party won in 1949. And the Communist Party adopted a lot of ideas from the Soviet model, in which it were organizational. And if I may put it this way, the Communist Party of China was an institutional innovation, that it was able to control this large, unwieldy bureaucracy to, in their own words, to deliver goods for the people, okay? I mean, to deliver China out of poverty, out of foreign invasion, nearly dismemberment, etc. And so Chinese see them in a long historical sense. But a lot of what happened with China was really due to the Cultural Revolution under Chairman Mao, which went through a very tumultuous period, extreme left, but brought everybody to the same level of poverty. And then in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping, the successor to Chairman Mao, basically opened up to what was called the four modernizations: modernization of agriculture, modernization of industry, modernization of science and technology, and modernization of defense. Okay, so now the point to remember is that the Chinese have a very long tradition of strategic patience, long-term horizon, and also great strategists. And to a large extent, the present administration is an inherent, are successors to this long-term strategy to reunify China and to make China great again. Okay, now this is an American phrase, make America great again, but China was seen as a great power, central kingdom in the Ming Dynasty. Up until 1750, the Chinese economy was roughly 25% of world GDP. And then it dropped to a low point of less than 5% of GDP by 1950. Okay, so it's a massive decline and then a revival. And today China is roughly 14% of GDP, world GDP. So, you know, China's rise has been so fast and so miraculous that even the Chinese have difficulty understanding where they succeeded, where they failed. So unlike in the West, as particularly in America, there is what is known as a Washington consensus. The word Beijing consensus is actually a Western invention. I think Rob Daly would know Joshua Ramos Cooper, who invented the term. But actually the Chinese cannot agree amongst themselves on what was their formula. But what was the formula of the success? And if I may put it in a very quick way, China is actually extremely fractal in the sense that the basic organization is the family. And then, you know, from the family, it became the clan, the village. And then what the Communist Party did was to introduce the cell. And the cell basically ensured that whoever runs the country or runs the village, etc., follows policy. And the policy basically is about the communist principles, which is, you know, wealth should be equally shared and the socialist, you know, model. Now, I don't want to get into whether you agree or disagree with this, but what essentially happened is that the old antique structure that has been in existence in China has now an invention that is the Communist Party structure that is now 90 million members who actually make sure that the country, you know, deals with its own contradictions. Now, what are these contradictions? Wen Jiabao, the former premier of China, said famously in 2007 that the country's economic growth trajectory was unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable. And, you know, it is, you know, is this book that I highly recommend you read by Arthur Krober, you know, on China's economy. China is essentially an autocratic, bureaucratic, one-party state. But it's full of contradictions because, you know, when the Communist Party took over, the country was fundamentally agriculture. You know, 80% of the person was agriculture. By the time the communists, you know, put in the system, which was essentially Russian, the private sector was basically almost zero. But by the time Deng Xiaoping put in his reforms, it was still 85–90% state-owned, and today it's 1/3 GDP produced by the private sector, 1/3 by the state sector, and 1/3, roughly speaking, by the foreign or foreign joint ventures. Okay, so the system has changed tremendously. But what are the contradictions in China? Well, it's imbalanced and it's bureaucratic, but the system actually managed to deliver outcomes. It is autocratic, and yet it has very good feedback systems. What the party does, even though it controls the media and ensures that it understands, it actually has very good feedback on what the people want, how they, what they like, they don't like. And that system, of course, a lot of outsiders dispute, but it actually delivers. And that's how they delivered on poverty. That's how they delivered on housing, how they delivered on infrastructure, and how they delivered on trade and the transformations. Now, the other contradiction is that it is a one-party centralized administration. But surprise by surprise, even though the central government accounts for 45% of all revenues in China, or the tax revenues, the local governments account for 85% of expenditure. It is highly decentralized to the local levels. And the local governments and the local parties ensure that they deliver the services to the people. And the best way to think about this is during COVID, when literally they locked down half the country. That's 700 million people, right? Because the countryside was less locked down. But 50% of the country is now urban. You had no problems delivering water, food, electricity services, all the essentials, including high-speed Wi-Fi. And because the Chinese system is much less one-directional, you can make money doing the Wi-Fi in China. So essentially, what are the lessons? How did the Chinese do this? This is a very interesting thing. The first thing people tend to forget is that even though they may be communist, they are extremely fiscal and financially prudent. They don't print money, okay? In 1949, when the Communist Party took over, the inflation was 1,000+%. They brought it down to near zero within 2 years. They ran fiscal, not surpluses, but at least balanced budget. And they operated on a very conservative fiscal financial basis. However, on developmental side, particularly after Deng, but even under the Mao period, they were very bold on innovation, sometimes too bold. But because most of the top level bureaucrats are engineers, they had an engineering approach to development and they don't believe in economic theories, etc. They are extremely pragmatic, a lot of common sense. The simple phrase, black cat, white cat, as long as the cat, they don't care whether it's black cat or white cat, as long as they catch mice. So it's extremely pragmatic. And then, whether you believe this or not, they say, seek fact from truths. They literally go in and do grassroots search on any policy issue, get the feedback from everywhere, and then they make decisions whether to move forward or to move back. They are extremely adaptive. The way the Chinese system works is exactly like China Incorporated. The whole system is delegated down to many areas. You set up the experiments to allow the cities, the provinces, and the towns and villages to compete with each other. And they delegate them to experiment. If it works, then you implement the experiment all over the country. And guess what? Not only do they experiment, they have a top-level architecture. The 5-year planning is not the Soviet type of planning. It's actually to ensure that the system is consistent. They delegate authority down to the lower levels. They allow competition. And if, let's say, Shanghai does well, the party secretary of Shanghai, the secretary general, are transferred and promoted to different areas to implement where they succeeded into different areas. And so the result is that the organization, the China as a whole, as much, although they still have very big disparities, very meritocratic, competent management of the whole system. Then they are learning. Every time they make a mistake, they retreat, regroup, and move forward. That was learned from the guerrilla warfare during the Civil War and the war against the Japanese, what they call 打打退退. If the enemy advances, we retreat. If the enemy retreats, we advance, right? Every time, learn, learn, learn. And then they learn how they grab the big and let go of the small. They don't muck around with the details. Let the lower levels handle the details, but the center handle the big strategic issues. They are also experimental by crossing the river by feeding the stones. But there is one area that a lot of people forget. The party actually inherits the Confucian value system, which is that the system must be people-based. So even though there's huge amount of income inequality during the last 40 years, essentially, the party understands that it has to deliver to the masses, right? So guess what? China has 86% home ownership, 86%, right? In Hong Kong, it's less than 50%, right? The rest is actually public housing. So the whole idea is to spend money on education, probably not enough on health, probably not enough on pensions, but essentially the amount of attention to social welfare is huge. So to a large extent, and then the next item, they spend a lot of money on education, innovation, and competition. And they realize that through trade is a win-win. That's why the Chinese don't like trade wars. They pay a lot of attention to maintaining the existing multilateral trade order, and they like the multilateral system that exists. Now, they may not like some of the rules, but this can be negotiated, and that's where things come in. So I think the key questions were about intellectual property. Now, in this area, the Chinese have been very clever in order. Now, there's no doubt about it. There are abuses, okay? But the Chinese have been extremely clever to play off different foreigners to say that if you can't give me the IPR, somebody else will. So if you notice the discussions, every discussion that they make with foreigners, they actually say, what can you give us in return? So if you want the Chinese market, which is huge, they are willing to give the outdated technology or second or third rate technology, they're very happy to get it. And of course, as we know, the Chinese are now devoting massive amounts to R&D. R&D in China has now reached 2.3% of GDP per year, one of the, not quite the highest, but high. China produces 8.5 million graduates a year, of which 4.7 million are STEM graduates, science, technology, English and mathematics, something like that. So to a large extent, the Chinese devote increasing amounts to the technology and innovation. And there's no doubt, everybody was caught by surprise by the rise of Alibaba, Tencent, JD, even ByteDance and all this. And where do they learn it from? From abroad. And where is their strength in the innovation? Not in the primary innovation, but the commercialization of innovation. And where do they learn it from? They learn it from America, right? This is open managerial secrets that you can get in MBA's 101. But are there huge problems still in China? Absolutely. And the Chinese do not quite understand foreigners, and I can say the foreigners do not quite understand China. And how you get that dialogue going is very critical. Let me pose the issue very simply. Danny Roderick, one of the members of the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, has this beautiful view about the trilemma between globalization, democracy, and sovereignty. This may be very simply put. Let's not talk about sovereignty first. Let's talk about democracy and democracy in terms of social policy and globalization. Globalization is a win-win. Everybody accepts that trade is win-win. But by the time you get the benefits, who ensures that that win-win is fairly distributed in your own country? It's purely domestic. Foreigners cannot interfere in your domestic, how you allocate the losses or the losses within your country, and you allocate the gains. So I disagree with everybody says this is pure democracy. No, whether it is capitalist, is democratic, or is socialist, that's an ism. What really matters is what you deliver to your own people, okay? And that's the key that you need to understand. It's not about rhetoric, it's about delivery to your own people. Do you deliver the justice, the morality, the inequality, the equality that the human people demand, also human dignity and human rights? But then you add the sovereignty issue. If you add in the sovereignty issue, you go into an arms race. And we all know that arms race, by definition, particularly between nuclear powers, is lose-lose. So the rational issue is that you have a win-win on the left-hand side and a lose-lose on the right-hand side. And in the center, which your own country, and only your country can deal with the inequality in your system because it is your domestic policy choices. So there we are. We are exactly like what Buckminster Fuller said. We are on the spaceship Earth. You and I are all on it. Okay? Either we choose mutually assured destruction or a burning planet, and how we deal with the rights and dignity and harmony between us all. And this trajectory is a critical path that we don't have much room to maneuver. If we do it wrong, we will go to mutually assured destruction. Or we burn ourselves up because we don't take care of the planet, or we go into civil war because we don't take care of justice and equality amongst ourselves. So the choice amongst us all, and you can see where I come from, I'm a great believer in peace. I'm a great believer in morality. I believe that we, particularly the young, who are rebelling against climate change, rebelling against inequality, we need to persuade the current leaders how to go on the right path. That's what we need to do. Let me stop here.
Absolutely. I think that's a great sort of segue to this discussion of Spaceship Earth and this trilemma, as you've described it and other authors have described it. This balance between globalization, democracy, and sovereignty is definitely something I'm sure Robert is excited to talk about. I'm sure as someone coming from the geopolitical perspective, sovereignty may be one of those critical questions that you've been thinking about a lot, especially in regards to China and some of their claims to sovereignty in some places. Okay. So I'll let you go with it. Go ahead, Robert, and thank you so much, Andrew, for speaking on that.
Well, thanks. And I'd also like to thank Andrew Sheng. I thought that was a superb kickoff for this conversation. And I especially want to pick up on one of your recurrent themes, which is about contradictions within China, evolution and change within China, and the facts that there are different views within China. Washington has lost track of this central fact and has decided that China is inexorably, monolithically one thing, moving in one very dangerous direction. The current discourse from Washington is that China has stopped evolving, we know what it is, and therefore we can act. Whereas the story of modern China has always been a story of change and a fantastic adaptability on the part of the Chinese people. And I think that it remains so. And a lot of these contradictions, this uncertainty, within China, I think that in those ongoing discussions, perhaps there's hope that we can avoid some of the worst outcomes, but we've lost track of that. At the same time, before I get into the sort of main comments that I've prepared, I would also want to challenge an aspect of Andrew's presentation, not because of what it included, which I think that, this tradition of this bureaucratic culture, bureaucratic civilization in China deserves the central focus that it was just given. I think that's right. It's absolutely fundamental to understanding China. But there's another problem with these claims about meritocracy and adaptability and feedback and performance-based legitimacy. All of those things are true insofar as they go. But here's the question. How come the central tenet of Xi Jinping's power has been an anti-corruption campaign? Why is that deemed necessary? On the one hand, from Xi Jinping, we get statements like, to understand the success of China, you have to understand the leadership role of the Communist Party, which he's now the head of. So only the Communist Party can save China. This is an old Maoist phrase, which now has modern interpretations. Only the Chinese Communist Party can save China. Well, Xi Jinping, what is the biggest problem you face? Oh, well, that would be the inherent and pervasive corruption of the Chinese Communist Party. Well, excuse me, teacher, I have a question, right? How can these things, Xi Jinping, both be true? So there's something wrong here. There's something in the center of this success, which even the Chinese themselves say is rotten. And it's been interesting that while Xi Jinping has gone after the corruption of the Chinese Communist Party, there has never been an explanation about how you could have this contradiction of greatness, the essential qualities of the Communist Party, and yet pervasive, destructive, perhaps existentially threatening corruption. So there's something is amiss in all this. And then there's another aspect that I think is coming out in the global discussions we'll come to in a minute. And that does have to do with values. And Andrew Sheng, I think also emphasized something that is constantly forgotten in Washington now. This people-based, quality of the Chinese Communist Party that does go back to Confucian values. Ai ren, love people, show benevolent compassion for the people. There's a sense in Washington, and you hear this from Secretary of State Pompeo, from Vice President Pence, this good people, bad government dichotomy that they're attempting to set up, which I think is just false. China, I would argue, like the United States, has the government it deserves. Good, bad, and indifferent. Government tends to reflect culture. But when you say love people, it does raise the essential question of what is your model of human flourishing? What is your operative model of the good life? And it seems to me that the Chinese Communist Party's model is that we are, as a species, Homo economicus. That is to say that as long as our economic, material, technological needs are met, and as long as we have increasingly good outcomes in public health and education and hygiene, which the Chinese Communist Party cares very much about, that's it. That's the sum total of performance-based legitimacy, is satisfying Homo economicus. And this doesn't permit of any talk about social and political rights, individual freedom, sort of spiritual needs, self-expression, creativity. Are those things that in the West and in the sort of post-Enlightenment world are seen as essential constituents of human dignity? Those are largely and increasingly denied in Xi Jinping's China. Commercial freedom, the scope for commercial freedom to buy, to choose, to dress as you want, to work where you want, to go to your own university, these increase in China, have been increasing in China. This is a huge benefit. I first got there in '87, but these questions do get invoked. And so I wanted to mention that to not in any way to challenge what Andrew said, but to add another dimension to it. So a few things quickly. The current moment in US-China relations and global geopolitics, a few notes about the blame game, and then a few notes on the unknowns going forward. The current moment, we have seen major changes since first the advent of Xi Jinping and then the advent of Donald Trump. And you see this especially in the American National Security Strategy of 2017, which named China, together with Russia, but primarily China, as what were called revisionist powers. This is a debatable claim, but revisionist powers, I think that's debatable, but also named it as America's greatest long-term strategic challenge. On the geopolitical front, I think this is unquestionably true, that China poses an enormous challenge. And then, of course, on the after that, we have seen the trade war, the tech war, Huawei, now TikTok. We have seen China's imprisonment and treatment of Uyghurs interpreted through this lens. We then have, on the foundation of that already deep and pervasive distrust that already had us on the cusp of a Cold War in many ways, we have the pandemic. We have tit-for-tat journalistic expulsions. We have domestic and economic recessions looming. We have American chaos of various kinds. And then every week, there's something else: the Hong Kong national security law, the killing of about 40 Indians on the Sino-Indian border, questions about TikTok, China's aggression vis-a-vis Taiwan and in the South China Sea, the closing of consulates. It keeps on coming up. And then in addition to all of that, as you know, we have as an accelerant America's 2020 election, deep divisions in the United States as a continued source of uncertainty. We have in the United States, to me, what's really been most concerning in the long term about the arrival of Trump is that it has legitimized anger at fellow Americans as the very engine of American politics. Not something that's kind of vulgar at the margins that we slap down, but as the very engine is anger. And so now the two countries, China and the United States, have drifted apart in a very important way. And I'm not just talking about the South China Sea. That's symptomatic. Okay, the real issue, in my view, is that from 1978 until 2013, the advent of Xi Jinping, there was more or less a common narrative between China, the United States, and the rest of the world with reference to China's rise. And the common narrative had to do with advancing human welfare. It's exactly what Andrew referred to, the lifting of however many, 800 million, let's just say lots of people out of absolute poverty, an untrammeled good, right? And the narrative about China's rise was about that: China integrating, China adapting, China changing. And this was very exciting. And it wasn't just about lifting people out of poverty. I remember living in China in the late 80s. And now, of course, we have consumer culture as the sum total of everything in China. And the excitement is about new apps. But I remember living in Beijing when what was exciting on that week in Beijing was that Milan Kundera's novels were now going to be available at the Xinhua bookstore. I remember when Sartre became available, when Freud became available. It was also about ideas. It wasn't just about Homo economicus in those early days. It was very much about ideas. So we had a common narrative. That's gone. There now is no common narrative about the meaning of China's rise. We have separate narratives from which we draw different lessons. We appeal to different sets of facts. And it's not just China and the United States. It's much of the rest of the world is increasingly suspicious about what China intends. And not just because of America's propaganda and the line that Washington has been pushing. Both Beijing and Washington have been bullying other nations behind closed doors. But it's not just that. We do not see universal applause for the spread of China's influence and power. Valuing of trade relations with China, absolutely. Admiration for what China has produced, yes. But we see deep worry about what China's power is really going to mean. And I would note too, with reference to Andrew's excellent introduction, that this Chinese bureaucratic culture, civilization, which they invented and which was self-consciously imitated by France and by other places around the world, Now that China seeks to be a global power, another contradiction, a fundamental contradiction, comes up in China. And that is that this bureaucratic civilization, which at times has been meritocratic and at times hasn't been. It's not a simple story. But it has always been China focused. China is extremely insular. The question for this bureaucratic civilization was not just, what is the good and how do you secure it? It was how do you 治天下? How do you essentially manage everything under heaven, meaning China? The question of this bureaucratic civilization was a Chinese question, understood as such. This is why Xi Jinping refers constantly to 中国的特色, the Chinese special characteristics, history and traditions and lessons without which China cannot be what it is. Xi Jinping, when he speaks about contemporary policies, he references the Chinese tradition and says that it is the Chinese tradition, China's particularism or exceptionalism, which compels certain policy moves now. It is highly, deeply self-referential. It is enabled by that within China, but I would argue that it's crippled by it in the international realm because the rest of the world is not China. So one of its fundamental contradictions is what happens when you try to apply these modes and methods and these lessons of China to the rest of the world. And it's not going well for China. There is a growing sense, I would say, in the United States, but also in the developed and I hesitate to use the phrase free world, it's too fraught, but let's use it as a shorthand. There's a sense that if China, the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy, is going to be about winning deference through dependence, leveraging wealth to legitimize the illiberal practices of the Communist Party. If the Communist Party is going to try to impose its practices and legitimize them internationally, and I would argue that it is, then there's a sense that we just can't work with these guys, that there's a lack of interoperability at the level of values. So we have also a growth in normative language, the sense that China is bad, it's a bad actor. In the United States, that's now the narrative. Senator Tom Cotton has called this an evil empire. There's a lot of normative language. Of course, China also has normative language about the United States. It's a little more polite, but it means the same thing, that the United States is hegemonic, unreasonable, blind to history, delusional, addled about its own trajectory, namely its decline. So the two powers are competing to have their versions of events, their viewpoints, their practices affirmed as a global standard. Awful lot of blame shooting back and forth between the two sides. Now, we are competing, the United States and China, but it's not just a bilateral issue, it's broader than that, to be the primary shaper worldwide in outer space and cyberspace of trade and economic regimes, of security architectures. We're aiming to lead in the development, marketization, and regulation of global technologies. But we're also aiming to be the leader in the formation of global norms and in the value systems that underlie them. This is serious business. And we're also although it's serious business, there's been a lot of childish and destructive rhetoric and blame going back and forth between the two. Both sides hold that the other side is entirely wrong. Who's correct? The answer, as usual, is that they both are. Both sides tend to be right about what's wrong with the other guy and blind as to their own deficiencies. And I think what you see in many areas is a consistent pattern of chronic issues on the Chinese side and acute provocations on the American side. So that, for example, in the area of trade, yes, America launched the trade war in terms of the specific imposition of tariffs and the pursuit of all of this. It is nevertheless true that this was aiming at addressing long-standing chronic issues on the Chinese side that it is known about and heard about from America and other nations for decades. That is also true. So the chronic issues of a lack of reciprocity, a lack of openness, the nature of some support for state-owned enterprises, intellectual property theft, these are not new issues. These are chronic issues in China. you then have an acute provocation on the American side. It's also true in tech. The ban of Huawei, going after TikTok, these are all acute American actions or provocations. And we can argue about the wisdom or unwisdom of any one of them. But let's say in general, yes, it's been an acute action of the Trump administration. But it's all in response to chronic situations within China. You take the case of Huawei. Would China let an American company build out its 5G network? No way in hell. It is so impossible that the question is never even asked. We never even refer to the fact that the American telecom, that China has mapped out all of this long since as areas of strategic concern and banned these places. This has to be said, has to be reminded. It doesn't matter what you make of Trump. It's nevertheless true. Social media, we're seeing TikTok, a possible ban, more likely a very strange acquisition that has aspects of a mob-managed deal about it. WeChat is next. The rationale for banning TikTok essentially says no Chinese companies can collect data in the United States. But of course, China has long since banned Google and Facebook and Twitter. So again, acute American responses to chronic situations. And this is true in financial decoupling. It's true with Confucius Institutes. It's true with journalists. So what we have is chronic conditions in China, which are serious and debilitating, and acute conditions in the United States. And the chronic and the acute are exacerbating each other. So both sides, in a way, are to blame. To risk a lurid analogy, if we see US-China relations as a patient, as a body, in general, if a patient has both chronic and acute conditions exacerbating each other, they are near death. This is an end-of-life case. US-China relations are not well. So what are the possibilities? And I'm speaking in US-China terms, but again, it's broader than that. Well, the patient can die. What does death look like? It means a true sort of new Cold War situation, mutual alienation, very deep, antagonism to the other nation as a fundamental organizing principle within our own borders. And this surely includes, as Andrew has said, the resurrection of mutually assured destruction, again, not just as weapons procurements, but as an organizing principle with psychological impacts of both societies. And it isn't just going to be nukes, it's cyberspace and outer space. And I'd say we may have already passed the point of no return on this one. So the patient can die. The patient can somehow recover or be resurrected. They can rediscover that our common interests outweigh our disagreements. Not likely, even under a Biden administration. And then there's a third possibility, and this is where I think we are right now, and this is where this analogy becomes lurid, is that the relationship can become something somewhat short of death, because we really don't want to take that final step. And this is sort of a zombie relationship, and that's where I think we are now, is a zombified relationship. And to push it just a little bit, I would say that there are two kinds of zombies now. One is the old classic Night of the Living Dead zombie. And this is the US kind of zombie. Slow, plodding, zombies are trying to do the things they did when they were fully alive. They're going through the motions, but they're ineffective and they're kind of nostalgic and sad. That's the original zombie. Then you've got the World War Z 28 days later zombie. These are the newer zombies. They're fast. This is more like China. The World War Z, I'm out of time, zombie is faster, adaptive, voracious. Both types of zombies are dangerous in their own ways. Neither side is fully alive. Neither type is fully alive to its own circumstances, its own limitations, and they're dead to certain possibilities. And so that's where I think we are. We're on the cusp of most likely something like an extremely dangerous, wasteful, immoral, and again, very dangerous new Cold War. It's hard to see what the brakes on that may be. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think it's safe to say, sort of following this body-patient metaphor, that the US-China relationship is on life support. And I think it's also safe to say that this sort of action-reaction cycle of chronic issues being compounded by acute, I would say, not just issues, but sort of responses to long-standing issues. These sort of one-off, very patchwork solutions sort of manifest themselves in ways that negatively impact the relationship. And with that, thank you, Robert. That was a really great breakdown of sort of the expanded contradictions of the way that those contradictions, both in the U.S. and in China, affect the relationship. And Rob, if you want to speak on that a little bit and round us out before we get to some questions, go ahead.
Well, I start by thinking of the rock band The Zombies, and their most famous song was "She's Not There." And if the body was a she that you were referring to, I think it is in zombie status. And I enjoyed both of your presentations. They're both very, very rich, and I'll try to add a little bit of texture. Orville Schell and John Delaney wrote a book a few years back called Wealth and Power. And in it, they created almost a scenario of tectonic plates clashing. Two philosophical systems we'll call Western and Cartesian Enlightenment and the Confucian style system that Andrew and Robert have referred to. But more importantly, there was a woundedness that came from the Opium War, where the British played a role, and the Japanese invasion in the 1930s. And the scenario that was posited by Schell and his co-author was that there would be a tremendous wound in the politics within China to regain what they called the status of the Middle Kingdom, would become very powerful, and it would clash with the United States, which had been the head of a world empire. And it's because these were philosophical systems and because of the intensity, size, and scale. I mean, China is like, how would I say, engaging in development, but it's not like the island of Tonga, where when you pull them up with the tugboat, everybody's happy. China is so big, it can swamp the tugboat. And I felt very strongly, I've been visiting China quite regularly since 1990, that this evolution, the swamping of the tugboat, the fear of the China 2025 report, as you've all talked about, intellectual property rights, cyber attack, there is an inherent instability now. And that's why I think Robert's zombie metaphor is such a good one, because we do need, in order not to die, to cooperate on climate. But we're in this place where the contradictions are profound. America is a political economy that, in my view, is too much about the power of money. America had a situation where a number of sectors engaged in foreign direct investment and export back to the United States. It was very profitable. Wall Street used to dream of the modernization of the Chinese financial market and the integration with the world, and that they would play a leading role. Many of the leading investment banks and funds hired many of the children of the princelings in China. There was a great deal of promise. And as they both our previous speakers talked about, the technology sector, which was considered America's new comparative advantage, was blocked in China. So I could see one other dimension that was very important was that within China, later foreign direct investments, not the ones that just required low wages and environmental laxity to maintain profit margin, but later knowledge-intensive industries thought they would go into China and they would, which you might call, achieve almost fantasy-like economies of scale. But the diffusion of the intellectual property rights and the setup of competitors, and perhaps the state supporting those competitors, created a frustration in America. The traditional low wage, low environmental profit margins had to diminish as China had to clean up its climate and as they had to raise the living standard of their workers. Wall Street was frustrated. The convertibility of the renminbi is not taking place. The coalition of powerful interests in the United States that would lobby against a trade violation related to currency manipulation started to disintegrate. This is before Donald Trump. If you go to the Council on Foreign Relations, people like Kurt Campbell, a gentleman named Stilwell, and others were writing reports about how this relationship was breaking down in 2014 and 2015. Move to the other side. Andrew, I think you were with me once when we met with Wang Shishan. He looked at me, and Robert Daly, I had a big grin on my face when I was listening to you, because he said to me, America is very insular. I have seen every Academy Award-winning movie since Gone with the Wind. I have read Moby Dick. I have read John Dos Passos. I've even read David Foster Wallace. What American official, and he pointed at me, he said, Mr. Johnson, what American official has read our 4 great novels or knows anything about our cinema? He went on in that conversation to talk about, I used the analogy of the tugboat being swamped, that globalization had the potential for people to be all made better off and no one worse off, but that China was powerless because in the United States, what I'll call the trade adjustment assistance, the redistributional powers were stagnant. In our money politics, many times what people did who made money was lobbied to reduce or not repair or enhance infrastructure, education, health, and other things. And so the despair at the hands of globalization, according to Wang Shishan, was not necessary. It was implied as a challenge by the size and scale of China entering the global economy. But the failure was in American governance and in the transfers and support so that everyone did as well or better off. That did not take place. So now we're at a place, and Robert Daly, you did a beautiful job of kind of starting with what a lot of scholars now call otherness, the legitimacy of anger. It's used in racial politics and gender politics domestically to what you might call mask or divert attention from where the distress originates. It's used vis-a-vis Mexico. It's used vis-a-vis China. And I think the toxicity that we are now experiencing emanating from an American attempt that predates the pandemic, but it's continuing to accelerate in the tension. This attempt to stabilize a political coalition that rightly said the system is rigged, but the diagnosis was not followed by a prescription to heal America, and instead turn on others as a cause. America is very ill right now as a political economy. China has to regain what I will call responsibility and rapport with the world. And that's where Robert Daly, I believe, was right on target, talking about essentially looking inward. The last 2 times I've been to China, lots and lots of officials said to me, the most important thing is going from a narrow elite education system where the people who pass the tests become the leaders of the state to a broad-based knowledge-intensive education system. But the other thing they talked about was as they accelerate from the middle income trap, they believe the next engine of growth for the world economy is Chinese next phase of development, but that they can close their borders and largely achieve that. though I think in the realm of modernization and technological change, they may be missing some of the ingredients that are necessary. But nonetheless, closing off the Chinese market for Huawei to cross-subsidize gaining market share elsewhere will not be tolerated. The intellectual property rights theft and building replicated firms and leaving the original foreign direct investors kind of stuck in the mud will not succeed. So I believe you're right, Robert, and Andrew, you can speak to this. China has to come up and beyond what Orville Schell talked about and re-envision a collaboration with the world, not a, what you might call, opportunistic using the world for its own gain, when so many of the things are so violently in conflict with open commerce. And the provocations that Robert called acute are largely reactions to that. And in many ways, what they're saying is, okay, we thought you guys were going to converge and you're not going to do it. So we're going to stop the game right here. The Chinese can evolve. They can make offerings, and perhaps under a Biden administration, move, how would I say, between zombie and resurrection. I won't think it happens imminent, but we can, and with the need to cooperate on climate, we can move further towards resurrection. It's a very, very troubled time, and I'm grateful to you at YSI for hosting this today, because I think this is one of the most important frontiers and challenges for the health and well-being of the world economy in the years ahead.
Yeah, Rob, thank you for wrapping it up really beautifully. I think sort of number one is we'll be sort of transitioning to the open discussion Q&A portion. So if people have questions, you're watching on YouTube, you're watching on Zoom, you can start sort of plugging those in the chat as I sort of wrap it all up before then. But that was a really intricate sort of wrap up of a longer discussion that we've been having. And I think fundamentally, and maybe I'm wrong and someone can correct me, one thing that you all three sort of seem to agree on is that a lot of these issues stem from sort of this miscommunication or misreading or misunderstanding of one another between the US and China. Robert may have some objections to that and saying that there may just be some, I believe he used the term interoperability of values going on, not just miscommunications. But it definitely seemed like everyone agreed that those were occurring and they were sort of a spout for that conflict to arise. And so another thing that we all talked about was this sort of necessity of dialogue, whether it be, you know, addressing cultural issues, geopolitical or economic issues. All of you sort of discussed the fact that we need to both look inward to how we are perceiving and using our rhetoric to describe the other side or otherness, as Rob pointed out, but also engage in these sort of discussions with these other cultures and, you know, economic and geopolitical and governmental structures, so that we get a better perspective on why they work, why they don't work, and where the, you know, interoperability of values really comes out. So what areas we can work together and what areas, you know, that conflict will always sort of override our incentive to cooperate with one another. With all that, let's see if there are any questions. So I think the first question is from Alexander in the chat on Zoom. They are asking, here's a question for all the speakers concerning meritocracy and corruption. Let me find it again, sorry. Concerning meritocracy and corruption in the context of China's lack of democracy. INET associate Kishore Mahbubani, sorry for butchering that name, speaks of the US in comparison to China as a plutocracy. What would be the significant dimensions we should consider when analyzing how are money and politics intertwined in two countries, be it Chinese corruption or American plutocracy? Essentially, I think to condense the question down, sort of what is the role of money in the politics of both countries, and what role does that money play in influencing the relationship between the two?
I guess I'll step into the void for just a second. Several years ago, when Obama was still president, there was a consulting firm that did a study. And it said at the time the Supreme, all parts of American government, every congressman, Supreme Court justice, and everybody undersecretary and above, aggregate their personal wealth that they reported. And in a $15 trillion economy, it was about $6.25 billion. When you went to China at the time, it was about a $9 trillion economy on comparable measures. And the 72 people in the National People's Congress had family holdings of $65 billion. And this was a Chinese consulting firm saying that what you might call the plutocratic power and concentration and scale was actually much greater in China at that time than in the United States.
Yeah, Rob, you are absolutely right. The corruption that occurred in the middle of the 2010, sort of the 2005, the 2010 period, had got to very bad levels. Okay, and the corruption occurred because there were a few who became super rich, right? You know, if you own a coal mine, by bribing somebody, you know, you become not millionaire, but billionaire in Chinese terms overnight. But the corruption had got down to the level in which going to see a doctor required bribing. And that's what drove, you know, the man in the street in China to basically tell President Xi, when he took over, you have to get rid of the corruption. And that resulted in probably the largest, most extensive anti-corruption campaign ever that removed, I don't know how many, I don't have the exact count, but it reached up to the highest levels, and you know, including bankers or middle officials who had hundreds of millions in renminbi, of course, right, in cash or whatever at homes. So the Robert's point about corruption and homo economicus is absolutely right. In that growth period, rapid growth period, officials were being promoted on how much GDP they generated for their village, for their town, for their city, for their province. Okay? And the real issue is that you have to look at it from Chinese perspective. 40 years out of 2,500 years is actually, you know, a speck. And in that 40 years, China jumped from poor to second largest economy without the moral and the philosophical understanding of what it means in that speed. So, you know, let's get rich. Okay, you know, some got rich and it was unevenly distributed. So the biggest struggle at the present moment, and, you know, I see this, you know, within China, a lot, and a lot of people who go to China and talk to the Chinese intellectuals and even the grassroots people would know this. They are looking for the paradigm, the worldview about China's place in the world. It's not about the world worrying about China. China is also discussing what is their proper role and their own role within a China that is emerging as a power in itself. Because for the last 150 years, they considered themselves, you know, being victims of colonization, invasion, you know, and you know, civil wars, right? So every age needs a new paradigm, a new worldview. And just as in the West, Homo economicus is now bankrupt in many ways, morally, right? You cannot have Homo economicus at the cost of bottom 40, cannot afford their own living, cannot afford their health bills, no pensions, etc., etc. This is an issue that every society, Chinese, non-Chinese, we'll have to address. But it's still a moral issue. And the moral issue is, how do we have this conversation to decide what is that view? And if we look at even the Western history, the Enlightenment took over 300 to 400 years, right? So to a large extent, mankind has rushed into this huge acceleration without understanding their own moral bearings. And I think that is what we now have. That if we go along pure homo economicus, we'll go to war. And at the end, it's a 0-1 game for everybody. The conflict cannot be resolved.
Jay, I think you mentioned having a question. If you want to take a stab at it, or Robert, if you have something to contribute to that question, go ahead.
No, great answers. Let's go to another question.
Yeah, great. And I just want to really, again, I want to second Chris's thanks for all the contributions. I think the dimensions we've opened up here are just tremendously rich, and I would like to dive into some that I think are at the heart of it. So I started off at the beginning that obviously the rise of China is, if you will, if you use Andrew's term, in the paradigm of globalization, if you will. And there was a certain sort of organizing principle around, liberalizing the world economy and people benefiting. Obviously, what we've all been talking about is that in this rise, there have been contradictions that have emerged, not just in China. That's Robert, your presentation has shown that very, very nicely. But there's also now the United States is more narrow. The contradictory question about the United States' role here is that the United States is not defending globalization and openness in the same way anymore. It is retreating to a more narrow, not hegemonic, but more narrowly interested, power, major power, but no longer interested in the world system or an organizing role. So this leaves a vacuum at the geopolitical center of this world, which, Andrew, there's no other paradigm, no other organizing principle that would allow for us, the rest of the world or even China and US to sort of organize around at the moment. I think that's where I would like to gear the conversation towards. But there's another thing that I'm worried about, which is that the dimensions that you've been talking about is that there are clear winners and losers to globalization. And that's much more apparent in the United States, actually. And that's actually a conflict that we're trying to resolve in the United States primarily. And that's why we have Trump, I think, somehow speaking to the losers, speaking on behalf of the losers of globalization. And that's a dimension that is not just an American problem. This is anywhere you look, this kind of voice is emerging overall. And I think we have a clear danger here that we have very clearly society splitting up, partly through this rift that has come through the development of globalization. So that paradigm is sort of out the door, nothing to replace it. And now it is a more vulgar question about who can, take the gains of what's already been created here. And I think one question, of course, is China is still in a massive growth spurt. They can look inwards economically. Paradoxically, that's where the dynamic is, to look inward economically. Rob has pointed this out very nicely. But in the geopolitical role, Andrew and Robert, you both said this. On the other hand, it has to look outward. It has to look outside. So there's a clear sort of switch persona that I'm sort of observing from this conversation, that China has to sort of go through to sort of be a hegemon in the global good, or in some way to go beyond its more narrow interest. And this is something that I'm not sure what the conversation looks like. And we have not even attempted to bring in the actual dimensions that are on the ground, what's going on with India, what's going on in the European Union, what's going on with Africa as a rising continent, what's going on with potential migration crises, which are also spilling into these conversations. So I'm just wondering about this sort of the inner society splits and the contradictions. I think I'm pretty clear about that in the United States, but maybe we can also speak about what are these different layers of different interests within China that are also pretty clearly part of this conversation right now. And that's not so overt to me personally as a particular problem. And maybe there's an opening within China that actually might allude to potential sort of way forward as a global, organizing principle.
Robert, I mean, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, please.
Sorry. No, let me tell you how, the situation is seen this side of the Pacific. The issue is that when two elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. Okay, nobody wants to be caught in the middle, to tell the truth, right? Because what has happened is somebody wants to choose sides, and the world is now in a very uncomfortable position because they're very clearly uncomfortable relations with each other, right? That part everybody accepts. The Chinese themselves, as I begin to analyze that issue, is that if they were to try and step up as what Robert Daly famously said, a responsible stakeholder, everybody thinks that they have an expansionary agenda. If they try to say, okay, if you want to fight on trade, we have a 1.4 billion domestic market, and our export levels are now declining down to less than 20% of GDP, and China is no longer running a current account surplus, basically squared. China can live off its domestic market. It can produce everything, and we just import commodities. Okay? And let's see who holds out better in this. Everybody will lose. We all know this. Okay? So to a large extent, what we now really need is jaw, not war. I mean, we are in this very difficult situation, which is not quite a divorce and not quite a separation, in which partners are fighting over the furniture. How do you divide sort of this or that? And it doesn't work like this, right? Throughout long history, it has always been about the balance of powers. And that's why it's a very complex situation when we move from a unipolar power position to a multipolar position. It is, it is a emergence of a, if not carefully managed, a chaotic situation. And so therefore, the key players, as well as the bigger players, including the smaller players who have a voice, needs to say, let's sit down and talk this through. That's all I can say, because as far as I know, we're no longer talking about, sort of in some respects, what I'm seeing is that other than physical conflict, every aspect becomes like war, currency war, trade war, sort of intellectual war, cyber war, right? If that carries on the way it's carrying on, it has only one bad outcome.
Right. I agree wholly with Andrew on this. I have a piece coming out today. The Asia Society has a Chinophile dialogue. You may know the Chinophile website. It's coming out today, building on actually precisely what Andrew just said, and it goes back to some of what Rob had covered as well. One of the answers, not a silver bullet, but one of the answers is to internationalize the problem. If you make the mistake in talking about US-China relations of speaking as if they're the only two countries on earth, then it's hard to avoid the conclusion that conflict is coming. It needs to be internationalized. And so what this is just a 500-word essay coming out today, and it's quixotic. I realize it isn't going to happen, but I believe it. The mismanagement of US-China competition is the greatest medium-term threat to worldwide peace. It's the greatest geostrategic medium-term threat to every nation, and it's a concern to every nation. And most of these nations are sort of holding back. They don't want to make a choice. They want to, they want the trade benefits from China. They sort of prefer the United States as a balancer in the security realm and as an institutional model. They resent being bullied by both sides. But they're acting as if they have no agency. They're complaining about these issues under Chatham House rules in various international conferences. And what needs to happen, if I'm right, that these problems, for the reasons Andrew just mentioned, are the greatest medium-term threat to world peace, then there should be a session on this at the UN General Assembly when it meets in September. That's what the UN is for. You need to bring all of these private comments, these worried whispers, and put them in front of the cameras, put them in front of the United States and China, internationalize and name the problem rather than waiting passively to see how much damage the two elephants are going to wreak. Does that solve everything? No, but I think it's an essential step. And it makes it much harder for China and the United States to go country by country, back room to back room, trying to coerce other countries into making a binary kind of decision. If the threat is as great as Andrew just said it is, and I think he's right, then it absolutely needs to be raised publicly at UNGA. And both America and China, but probably China more, would absolutely hate this. And the reasons that they hate it are a big part of the problem. And so simply naming it and getting it out there and having, I think what we need as a new narrative, and this is not anti-China, it's not anti-US, it's anti-mismanagement of their relationship. The narrative is that the mismanagement of US-China relations is a global threat on a par with pandemics and global warming. That's a narrative I think would be, if it were socialized, it would help to defend the US and China from some of their own worst impulses, as well as defend the rest of the world from some of these possible world outcomes. Again, necessary, but not sufficient.
Absolutely. I like the idea of sort of multilateralizing the issue to help kind of break down some of the barriers that have been created that kind of help stall progress in the relationship. I also really like the idea of sort of bringing middle powers who, as Andrew kind of pointed out, would be, I guess, the grass in the metaphor of the elephants, right? Those people who would be on the periphery or are sort of side characters almost in this larger narrative of US-China competition, but they do play an important role and therefore need to be sort of brought into that discussion. Absolutely. So I know we're running a little bit over time. So if any of our experts or people need to head out, absolutely. But while we've got you, we'll keep asking questions. We've got quite a few from the Zoom chat and a few from YouTube. So I'll go to the YouTube ones. This is from Matthew Savoy, actually, the head of the OWP. They ask about the legitimacy of the tit-for-tat strategy between the US, Canada, and China around the detention of Meng Wanzhou and the arrest of Canadians accused of spying in China. Generally, what are our sort of speakers' thoughts on the long-term implications of what I suppose you could call, to borrow Robert Daly's language, these more sort of acute foreign policy spats between the US, China, and I guess in this case, Canada?
I've actually spent a lot of time on this with the Canadians. The United States, when Donald Trump was meeting with Xi Jinping in late 2018, asked Canada to arrest the daughter of the founder of Huawei in Vancouver because she had lied to the United States indirectly. There are layers to this. About Huawei's ongoing involvement with Iran against certain sanctions. I think there's quite a bit of reason to think that she probably did do that. We'll see in the court of law. There's also every reason to think that this is, as a policy move, was really inept and stupid on the part of the American administration. They had many options. They could have announced, for example, that they were putting out a warrant, and that would have frozen her in Beijing and kept her from going to any country with which the US had an extradition treaty, and the point would be made. Now we've sort of got this just turd on the table and we don't know how to get it off. China has taken 2 hostages. That's the way to say it. They took 2 straight up Canadian hostages for revenge. Canada, which is the least culpable party in all of this, is now paying the highest price. And those two Canadians, Michael Spavor and Kovrig, are going to be in prison in China until about 6 months after Meng Wanzhou returns to China, if she does. That is the current state of play. What's most telling to me about this is it shows certain aspects of the ineptitude of the current American administration. This was simply a foreseeable bad idea from the beginning, but it also tells you a lot about China's disdain for middle powers, that it's willing to treat Canada the way that it has, to become, the country of hostage taking and the death penalty, despite their interests. They play pretty hard, and that's going to be a lesson that will not be unlearned by Canada. I don't see a good end to this unless through legitimate legal decisions of the Canadian court system, she is let go. And I can see a couple of potentially legitimate grounds upon which they could do that. And there would be a great collective sigh of relief, but it's by no means clear that that's where it goes.
All right. If no one has anything else they want to add on that question, we have a few more from the Zoom chat and some from our OWP correspondents before the event. We've actually gone nearly 2 hours without talking on this subject, which I was a little proud and surprised about. But sometimes I got to open that door and talk about our favorite subject, COVID. I got to ask one of our most asked questions from the correspondents before the event: how do you imagine that COVID, China's vaccine diplomacy, its impact on defense spending across the board, its impact on a number of things, right, geopolitically and economically, will impact the US-China relationship, especially for China, because as Andrew points out, they're sort of this fiscally disciplined country that's has this sort of traditional conservative financial policy. How do you think that specifically will play a role in their response to COVID, and will it sort of help relative to the US response?
Well, let me say this about COVID. COVID has forced me to think about this as an extreme event. It's an extreme event because if you don't act very fast to contain it, the outcome is very difficult to measure, but we know it's going to be huge. The person who I learned a lot from this is Nassim Taleb. Okay, think about the COVID as nuclear bombs. If it was held only by 3 or 4 major players who know that they are the big players, and if they throw bombs at each other, mutually assured destruction. But suppose every small countries, individuals can have access to nuclear bombs, what will happen? That accident will definitely happen. And as you know, as a very recent paper in Nature showed that if that happens, a small scale escalation of nuclear bombs would cover the whole Earth, and climate change would destroy 13% of world's food crops, and it will be in disaster. COVID is a little bit like that, right? If you don't act very fast to stop it, the minute it spreads, it's not like thinking about this as an accident. Oh, if I die in an accident, if the 2.5% of people die from car accidents and 1% die from COVID, why do I worry? Forgetting that if I go into a crowded bar, the chances of me getting COVID is probably 70%. And then if I get 70%, I go to another bar, that's multiplicative, right? So the whole issue is that there's a very fat tail from the COVID that changes the whole game. Now, what is very interesting in this is that China understood this. They were slow in reacting, but once they understood it, they clamped down it on very fast to prevent it causing a systemic failure. And the amount of spending that the Chinese have done, actually, is they didn't mind spending it because it was actually all domestic. Okay, and that as typically in China, they let the local governments deal with it because only the local governments know how to handle this at their own level, and then the central government give money, whatever is necessary to help where there is not enough. So there are many lessons from COVID that we need to draw some very important lessons on how to handle, systemic shocks to the system that cascades into a whole system failure problem. And that's what we're beginning to see. Not just that it's medical, but it's now economic, and then it leads to financial lockdown. And the solution to this at this present moment is printing money. Now, that can continue 3 months, 6 months. I mean, can you continue 2 years, 5 years? We are now into completely uncharted territory. Okay? So to the extent that the Chinese have been fiscally much more cautious, financially, the balance sheet of the People's Bank of China has not changed that much in the first 6 months of this year. Whereas the other three, Fed, ECB, and Japan, increased by $6 trillion. That's unbelievable, okay, by any standards.
Yeah, I think that kind of harkens to a great point, which is that COVID is really not just a medical issue anymore. And it's accelerating, as you kind of mentioned, the erosion or collapse, whatever you want to call it, of social, economic, and governmental institutions kind of across the board. One thing that I thought was really interesting was your sort of highlight of, I believe, is that Alexandra Witt's article from Nature about limited nuclear conflict. Great article. Definitely recommend to read. Yeah, it came out 2020, the Nature article. If anyone else has anything to say on that question, go ahead. Otherwise, we got some more questions from Zoom. I think we'll try and knock out just 2 more and then let everyone go. One of our questions is, do you think the US unilateral approach is giving China more influence on the global value chain in specifically places like the global South, whatever you may believe that to include? And what impact would China's influence have on a democracy in the global South if China becomes the largest economy in 2024, according to the Economist's predictions? So I guess a little twofold question. Let anyone take it where they will.
I guess I'll play with it and honor Wang Xishan's request by suggesting that the audience watch the movie Wolf Warrior 2, which is a Chinese movie about an individual who lost someone who he loved to a killing, but goes to Africa. And in Africa sees the oppression by Western colonialists and imperialists and leads the development of resistance. And the Chinese become what you might call catalyst to a much more just partnership. And I believe the final credits of the movie, I watched it a couple of years ago, are a scroll with words from the Chinese passport about their global responsibilities, and they're very powerful and heartfelt. I believe this movie is now the 3rd most watched movie in terms of box office and numbers in the history of filmmaking, in large part because of the broad-based ovation within China. INET has done, in 2018 December, with Justin Lin, a conference with African officials and Chinese officials in Beijing on the African development and the role of China. There is a lot of tension about what you might call the analogy to Argentina in the 19th century. When you build the entire transport system, distribution tends to control the profit margins and the production, and the Chinese building of ports and roads and highways for shipping gives them potentially a great deal of power and access to raw materials, which our 2 speakers spoke of as being very important, even if they are a closed economy, to be able to import. On the other hand, when I speak with African officials in the hallways at that conference, they somewhat echo the Wolf Warrior experience in the film and say, how can we not deal with the Chinese in this context, given what's happened in the relationship between Africa and the West, both the United States and European powers? And when I speak with Africans, our Global Commission on economic transformation, is its fifth report is about the development of Africa and the demographic bulge and what development strategies can allow a prosperous Africa as the population largely doubles between now and 2040. In that context, the what you might call dread about the development of US military presence, but not commercial presence, is remarked upon by many, many Africans.
Absolutely. I like this sort of dichotomy that's been created of this sort of military presence versus economic presence. And I think that's definitely going to be one of the sort of key points in Africa, especially as it comes to US-China competition there. From my understanding, Africa is definitely sort of expanding its reach in a number of regions across the globe, including Africa, you know, the EU with highway.
There are people like Jack Ma and his philanthropic arm, the Lujan Academy, which INET is working with, which are trying to envision how to deploy technology to integrate markets in the global South and in Africa in particular. And the question of how does a continent with many, many small countries create the public good of the internet infrastructure to help create an integrated market is troubling, it's challenging. But they are looking for ways where technology can be used, because in some sense, with the global supply chains and automation, the East Asian development model will probably not be the solution to African development in this next phase. And with climate change creating a loss of arable lands for subsistence farming and the growth of population, there are great challenges on that continent. But I've seen the Lujan Academy embracing visions of that challenge. Michael Spence, the Nobel laureate, has worked very closely with them on that.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that there are sort of people that are working on innovative solutions to bringing Africa into this sort of network of globalization, whether it be these sort of new, you know, economic institutions that China has created and taken part in as a way to sort of challenge US economic dominance in a lot of ways, or whether it be, as you said, Rob, maybe more through that sort of Western style, because maybe that Eastern Asian sort of preference for the way the economy works is not going to function as well just for those sort of smaller states that are rapidly growing in population and losing arable land. A lot of challenges that are sort of compounding one another, as you've mentioned. And with that, I think we'll get to our last question from Francis in the Zoom chat. How far is the current public discourse regarding China in the West, which is focusing on things like human rights violations and other negative aspects of Chinese policy, hindering the solution of conflicts between China and the West?
I think it's hard to answer that in a general way. You really have to get down to cases. I do think that the very real and worsening human rights situation in China, and then compounded by things like the use of technology, facial recognition, artificial intelligence, to go from authoritarianism to a sort of techno-totalitarianism, both that as a fact and then the international discourse about it contributes to this global sense, not global sense, but among freer and developed nations, that China again is sort of a bad actor, a place that offers economic benefits, but whose increased influence and governance one simply doesn't want. That general sense, while it doesn't have to prohibit, and it certainly shouldn't prohibit, many forms of cooperation, especially on the joint problems that Rob in particular has mentioned. In fact, it does make it very difficult, both because in the West, we're more hesitant to work with and trust China, and also because China hears these critiques as insults and attacks and resents them. And so that creates kind of a dissonance at their end and an unwillingness to cooperate. We cannot, and Chinese negotiators in the trade area over the past year, somebody like, Madame Fu Ying has said, we can't really work with you when you're always telling the world that we're the evil empire. So this goes back and forth both ways, but I think it's probably inevitable, because these moral valuations, and Andrew keeps coming back to the moral components of international relations. This is inevitable. So yes, it clearly gets in the way. It shouldn't do so absolutely, but you really need to get down to individual cases and issue areas to evaluate this, in my view.
Can I take a big picture issue about human rights? We are about to witness the greatest tragedy to human rights in recent history, when the COVID is going to set back, health, poverty, incomes, right, in very many parts of the world. That, particularly for the rich countries, to step back and quarrel with each other is a complete moral neglect, right? We really, if we don't want big people to get in, if China steps in to help out, they will say you've got an agenda. You're trying to take over the world. So if we don't get our multilateral act together, we will witness massive deaths, health problems, economic setbacks, declines in infrastructure, civil wars in many, many parts of the world that were already fragile or on the brink and will be set back into really problematic areas. And we all know the COVID is really problematic because, number one, these countries can't afford the vaccine. And if the vaccines are available, you'll go to rich countries first, right? And number two, if you ignore them, they will be the pockets where the coronavirus will still spread and then disrupt. And in the rich countries, we'll also have the lockdowns. And so we're in a health economic trap.
Could I just add one thing on that? Because I want to ask Andrew, because you've touched on a central difference in Western and Chinese discourses about human rights. I think a typical American, certainly a typical Washington response to what you just said, is that there's a distinction to be made between human rights and human well-being generally. And so what you've just invoked, which is what China invokes, is human well-being, but you called it human rights. So do we have a right to health outcomes, to food, all of these issues? Americans, when they speak of human rights, tend to think more about legal rights, freedoms of speech, freedoms of association. And so there's not so much a disagreement as a disconnect in the way that we sometimes speak of human rights as opposed to human well-being more generally. And so the Chinese response is, when we speak about issues of freedoms of speech and China's denying those to the people, they'd say, well, surely the human right to not starve is much more important. And the American response is, yeah, but of course, any government worthy of the name takes care of that. And both points are legitimate. I'm just saying that there's this disconnect in how we talk about human welfare as opposed to human rights. And do you see that as a confusion in the US-China dialogue? I want to ask that to you, Andrew, as a question.
It's a philosophical issue. Human right is seen as absolute, whereas a right comes with a responsibility. And they're entangled. You can't separate the two, right? I mean, the reality is the issue that there is always this discussion that this is absolute. It's not absolute. It's not atomistic. That is independent of everything else. Everybody is entangled together. And we can't unsort out, you can't disentangle China. You can't disentangle Africa, right? Because we are all in this together. And the more entangled we are, the more COVIDs, virus, terrorism, all these issues will kill us all. And until we work together to deal with this, and the Nobel laureate Eleanor Ostrom was absolutely right. Throughout history, human beings have always found ways to cooperate rather than fight their ways out of this issue. And therefore, we are at that critical moment when more than ever, if the world is to stay together as a viable world, both morally and economically and politically, we have to find a way to work together, because the alternative is unacceptable. That's my view. Sorry about this.
I think it's a pretty solid view to have. Absolutely. I think everyone sort of agrees that there is sort of this implicit responsibility, or in some cases, explicit responsibility, explicitly stated in sort of multilateral institutions and treaties to help kind of resolve these global issues that is completely failing, right? And I think that speaks to the sort of discussion between Robert and Andrew that just happened, sort of speaks to, again, what Robert called the sort of interoperability of values, whether that be philosophical, as Andrew pointed out, or otherwise. Andrew also pointed out something that I think is really important, which we haven't really gotten to touch on a ton, but I've sort of seen come up very recently a lot in the literature surrounding US-China relations and Chinese governance writ large, which is this looming sort of idea of digital authoritarianism, right? This idea that technology is being interwoven into Chinese society and other societies in a way that is being used and enabling their sort of repressive or oppressive, whatever you want to call it, whatever pundits want to call it, policies, right? Whether it be from like this social credit score system that people like to hark on about a lot, or even just facial recognition, which is being deployed globally pretty much, right? So it's definitely something to be on the lookout for in the next coming years. And I think more broadly, as an issue of sort of changing the face of governance. We have some more questions, but we have now been going for over 2 hours. So I'd like to give everyone a chance to, say thank you to our speakers. For me, thank you all. It was really awesome having you. Great discussions, great answers to questions. If anyone wants to kind of lead us off, say anything in closing, go for it. Otherwise, I'll let everyone go. And thank you all so much. It was awesome.
Thank you.
I'll just say I was lucky to be with these two guys on stage today. I felt like a surfer and the waves were good.
Thank you. I'll try to answer all the questions on chat, but I'll have to figure a way to do this. But I promise you I'll answer all the questions, okay? To my best of my...
And I guess just one last thought, mostly based on what Andrew was saying at the beginning and why I think it's so important. Washington now sees China solely as a security problem, rather than as a human proposition, one aspect of which is a security problem. And that's a big conceptual mistake. Thanks.
Yeah, and also from my side, I would like to thank Chris for a great job on moderating. It was the first time that OWP and YSI worked together, and I think this was a very fast 2 hours, a very rich and dense 2 hours. And I think we could go on, which is unusual for this time right now, because I think a lot of us have Zoom fatigue. I'm not having the sense in this conversation at all, which speaks to what we want to continue potentially. So Chris and I are in conversation, but having other webinars in this series. This was just the kickoff. So Andrew, Rob, and Robert, you might be back. At least we're going to circulate your work and keep that in the conversation. And if any of the participants, both from YSI or OWP, feel like you want to be maybe moderating a session or bring some ideas to us, please feel free to do that. You can obviously, if you're in YSI, you know me. If you're in OWP, you know Chris. I think I have many different ideas about where this can go. I already have something planned personally, which is the issue of platforms. That's now between Europe and United States, Amazon, and other issues. I think there's something very deep with a young scholar working on this issue specifically. She has done some specific research on this that we would like to bring into the conversation. And there's today's conversation has already put all these dimensions up on the fore. We have to talk about India. We have to talk about Africa as a continent. We have to talk about the European Union if we're talking about geopolitics. And we're talking about this global order that needs to be, reimagined right now. So if we talk about Andrew and the paradigm, that comes up again and again as a central issue. So this is just the beginning. Thanks again for your time as well from my side. And Chris, thank you for the great moderation.
Yeah, one last time. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, everyone. And see you soon, hopefully.
Great talking to you guys.
Great talking.
Thank you. Bye-bye.